All right, so we mentioned TCP Intercept being able to look at the traffic going on, look at the send traffic to a device, tracking those half-open TCP sessions. We're going to go ahead and run through a quick example here. In this case, we're going to configure TCP Intercept on router 6. In this case, looking at connections from the backbone side coming through to router 2. So for TCP Intercept itself, configured globally and configured using an access list. We're going to start off configuring an access list. Just commit any TCP traffic for the destination of router 2's loopback. IP TCP intercept, and look at our various options here. Different options we have, and you can set timeout values. If I want to have timeouts of a certain value, rather just keep my defaults. Drop mode, different options here. When I do have clamping start to go on, I need to start dropping connections or dropping incomplete connections. I can either drop the oldest connection or I can drop random connections. Resetting the fin at the end of the session, what sort of timeout to use for that. The basic access list to use. We're going to go ahead and configure that one in here at list 123. Again, it is configured globally, so it is going to be traffic that is passing through the device. The traffic passing through router 6. Now, beyond that, some other options here. We have max incomplete, and we also have 1 minute incompletes. So those are values for thresholds. Look at our options here. We'll say max incomplete first. Now we have a high value and a low value. We have the same for the 1 minute. As mentioned earlier, at some point, the device is going to jump in and say, okay, we've got too many connections through to this device, too many connections to this server. So in doing that, he can look and say, what value is my threshold for when I think that's too much? Again, it varies depending on what your particular environment is. And we'll just say a high value of 1,000. And we'll say 1,100. And there is a slightly different syntax in some of these versions. So it wants to set low value and a high value. So I'll say a low of 800 and a high of 1,100. And I also want to set the 1 minute values. And I'm going to set those a little bit lower. Max incomplete being all the incomplete sessions that I see, the 1 minute being looking at the most recent window, 1 minute. What is the most recent 1 minute sampling telling me for connections? And we're going to set this one a little bit lower. We're going to say 650, 350, and 650. So up to TCP intercept. Options I have here are connections and statistics. Connections, I don't have any current connections. Statistics, currently have 0 incomplete connections. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to another device. In this case, we're going to connect to backbone 1. In the actual lab, not going to have the ability to connect to backbone devices. Here we do have that ability. It can be any device you're connecting from. It just has to be something that's passing through the device running TCP intercept. It has to be traffic passing through that device. We're going to telnet to 150.1.2.2. And our password here. Look back at router 6. Looking at our connections, we do show the established connection from the client to that server. At statistics, did show that we did see the 0 incomplete, 1 established connection, and currently 1 for our connection requests per minute. Again, looking at our configuration there, we have a TCP intercept matching a list. In this case, just looking at our other defaults, having incomplete sessions for the max value as well as for the 1 minute value. Now, with those incomplete sessions, watch those very carefully. Those are thresholds, and those thresholds do need to be crossed. The way the thresholds work, if either of the high values is crossed, either the high for the max incomplete or the high for the 1 minute, at that point he's going to start clamping and start dropping those sessions. He's not going to stop dropping those sessions until it's fallen below both of the low levels. In this case, with a high of 1100, we're to have 1100 max incompletes at once. At that point, he has met the threshold, but he's not crossed the threshold. As he gets that next connection, the 1101 connection, then he would go ahead and start dropping, start clamping the sessions. For the most part, very straightforward. Access list configured. Again, it is TCP intercept, does need to be TCP traffic. Can't really do anything for UDP connections. Alternatively, you can get into other sorts of SYN flood or SYN protection on other devices. CBAC is one of those. CBAC also has incomplete values that you can set, as well as being able to set those options on the firewall. On the firewall, able to set it either on the NAT translation statements themselves, or also able to set those within the MPF framework. So different locations, different places that those items can be set. In this case, just looking through a basic setup here. Again, verify and validate whenever possible. In this case, tried connecting through the device, establishing a connection, and seeing that information fire off. So next we look at CBAC, iOS firewall, context-based access control, similar to the functionality on the ASA. Looking at the earlier methods we've talked about, being able to do things like lock and key, being able to do things like the reflexive access list, CBAC taking that a step further. So getting into deeper inspection, looking at deeper application layer inspection. So I mentioned earlier, talking about things on the ASA, being able to do, for example, a fix-up for SMTP or ESMTP, allowing just a certain SMTP messages to be allowed through rather than just saying your traffic on port 25, you must be valid and legitimate. Being able to get into deeper inspection for particular protocols. Watching the traffic leave the network, permitting that traffic back in based on the state information gathered. Again, being able to bypass ACLs, have the entries in the session table to be able to look at those items and see whether it's in the session table, it saw the session leave, allowing that to come back through a restrictive ACL. So TCP Intercept, reflexive access list kind of blended together and enhanced, bringing us to CBAC, which has more functionality. General CBAC configuration. Starting off, have a inspection rule configured. IP inspect name. Beyond that, having what protocols you want to inspect. Some of the more common ones, TCP, UDP, ICMP. In the newer iOS versions, there's a lot of additional items available. So if we just take a look at, we'll say router 1 here. A lot of different protocols available for the inspection. Again, it does vary depending on your iOS version, but newer versions have a lot more protocols. It does still have TCP UDP, but still has a lot more secure items and miscellaneous other protocols that it can look at and specifically allow. And we'll look at those in an example here in just a little bit. So basic setup of CBAC. We have an inspection rule. Inspection rule applied to an interface. We have a ACL restricting traffic. The state table looked at and then allowing it to bypass a blocking ACL entry if it's existing in the state table. We're going to look at a CBAC example. So in this case, similar to the example we had earlier, looking at router 1, TCP UDP ICMP traffic should only be allowed in router 1's frame relay connection if it was initiated from router 4. So in this case, looking at a connection on router 1, we're going to go ahead and start by removing our earlier setup there. And we're going to start by just taking off our access lists. Now with CBAC, we have two general things to be aware of or to be concerned with. We do have a lot of other items that we can tune, we can adjust. We do still have connections and timers and miscellaneous things that can be adjusted. However, the biggest things for CBAC as far as a basic understanding, basic configuration, is having the inspection rule configured properly and having the ACL configured properly. We're going to start out, take a look at our topology here. We've got router 1, and we want to restrict to traffic initiated from router 4. So we're restricting traffic, what's being allowed in on router 1's frame relay interface. The router 1's frame relay connection is going to have a strict ACL, and we're going to have an inspection inspecting the traffic coming from router 4 out to the frame relay cloud. Now, as far as inspection, we have different options for direction. In this case, what matters is that it's in the opposite direction as the ACL. So it could be inbound here on the FA00 interface in the opposite direction from a flow perspective of the ACL inbound on the serial 0.12. Or my inspection rule could be configured outbound on router 1's frame interface. In this case, we're going to go ahead and configure the inspection outbound on router 1's frame interface, and we'll come back to other adjustments with that in just a minute. We're going to go ahead and just clear this up here. We're going to start with an inspection rule. And we're going to inspect TCP, UDP, and ICMP. Now we've got our inspections there, TCP, UDP, ICMP. We're going to go ahead and configure an access list. Look at our existing access list so we're not overriding anything or using the same thing. One of the problems I see a lot of people do is get in the habit of doing access list 101, access list 101, and they end up using the same access list for multiple things and jumbling different sections together. Very careful about that if you are configuring access lists. take a minute, take a quick look at what you have existing on your device. In this case, we're just going to do a separate access list number. So it's 111. And we want to deny traffic. However, we want to still allow other traffic that we need. So we're going to start by permitting our routing protocol traffic, permitting our OSPF traffic. In this case, just going to leave it open, permit OSPF any. And then we're going to have a deny statement. Now again, this access list is being fairly strict. Depending on what other features or items we had configured, we may want to have other entries in here. If we had other items terminating on router 1, other VPNs, if we're doing SSH or Telnet for management, things like that, we may want to make sure that we have those entries allowed. Again, that goes back to a reason why you would like to have your diagram written out with what items you have configured, where your traffic flows are, so that when you go to create this access list, you're not having to go back and make entries to it. Go ahead and apply this inbound on our serial interface. Apply our inspection again in the opposite direction, so we're just going to apply this outbound. So we have our inspection applied in the outbound direction, access group applied in the inbound direction. Again, very restrictive on our access list. We are permitting OSPF traffic for our other connections here. We try to telnet to router 2, for example. Case not establishing. Turn traffic getting blocked. And try the same thing from router 4. Now router 4 able to establish a connection through, return traffic getting back. Take a peek back at router 1. Take a look at the information. Show IP inspect session, look at the existing sessions. In this case, you do show the existing session from router 4 connecting to router 2 for telnet. We can see that as an established session. That was a session that was inspected by the CBAC, was allowed through the firewall. Now, looking back at our inspection rules, now our inspection rules here were fairly basic. We're just looking at TCP, UDP, and ICMP. If we want, we can go ahead and add in some other options there. Start by just looking at our other options here. After your different protocols, some of them do have other options. You can get into having alerts, audit trails configured. You do also have the router traffic keyword. Now, the router traffic keyword can be very useful. In this case, looking at individual connections that were originated. Got a question for show access list. Show access list showing the permit and the deny. Again, the access is not showing the other session information that show IP inspect sessions for that. That answer the question on the access list? Question on the audit itself, does it take a lot of CPU? generally depends on the number of connections you have. Obviously, if you have a high number of connections in a production environment, it can take a lot. Generally, something recommended to do testing with simulated traffic flows for your environment. It's hard to say the exact CPU load. It's going to also vary by platform as well. There's going to be some CPU hit to that, but I don't know the exact percentages or levels on those. So we added in the router traffic option for TCP. We're going to go ahead and just add that for the other ones as well. UDP and ICMP as well. Now before, we were not able to telnet to router 2 from router 1. In this case, we now can. I'm going to jump over to another device here. While we're still connected to router 2 from router 1, we're going to telnet to router 1 from router 4 just to look at some other stuff here. So looking at this connection now, telnetting to router 1 from a different device, we don't want to break our existing session. On router 1, we do have an outbound session. Because we added on the router traffic keyword, able to see the connection from router 1 in the CBAC inspection. So being able to look at, again, that was added in later iOS versions, being able to look at traffic locally generated by the device itself. So not having to do the permitting traffic for TCP or UDP terminating on router 1 itself. Switch back to router 1 here and exit out of this connection. Some things to be aware of with that router traffic keyword. It does allow for some flexibility. Again, able to have the ability to not need a bunch of other entries for traffic originated by router 1 itself. Normally, traffic originated by router 1 would need to have those other permits in that return ACL, the inbound ACL. Other things to be aware of, looking back at our topology here, in this case, we were doing the inspection on the outbound direction. If we had been doing the inspection on the inbound direction on router 1's FA00 interface, that would not catch any router traffic because obviously router traffic out from router 1 to router 2 is not going to be coming in that interface. So direction does come into play when you're dealing with a router traffic keyword as well. In this case, would need to be in the outbound direction. So again, just able to look at particular traffic. We're going to go ahead and modify our inspection here a little bit more. Looking at our existing inspection rules. We're going to go ahead and just remove TCP from our list. We're going to inspect telnet traffic. Again, telnet doesn't have the option for router traffic. Some protocols do, some protocols don't. The TCP, UDP, ICMP do. Telnet in this case does not. Also, if you wanted to be able to telnet in the other direction and telnet to router 1, you would need entries in your ACL for that. So make sure to read through other sections. If other sections say you're supposed to do something terminating on that device, if I'm supposed to telnet to a device running iOS firewall or connect to that device, SSH or other methods like that, then I may need to have other entries in the ACL. For the most part, the most common problem I see people have with a iOS firewall configuration is misconfiguration on the ACL as well as confusion on the connection limits and where the inspection goes or can go. In this case, we added the inspection of Telnet. So we took off TCP inspecting Telnet here. I'm going to go ahead and switch back to router 4. And from router 4, we're going to go ahead and Telnet to router 2. We've got established from router 4 through to router 2. Moving back to router 1, looking at that session. Show that session established from router 4 to router 2. So showing that a session established through the device. Again, take a look and see what happens when we try from router 1 itself. In this case, the telnet option itself not having that router traffic keyword, so the traffic being blocked on the return ACL. Actually, we're going to go ahead and just modify our ACL so we can see the and put in a sequence here in the middle. That sequence 20. And change sequence 20 to a deny IP on any log. Logging set up on our console. And try that telnet again. And with that deny at the end, again, deny IP on any log can be very helpful. Situations like iOS firewall, in this case showing what traffic was denied. Actually, we're going to modify that a little bit further. With access lists in general, the more specific you are, the more information you get back. So in this case, I did have a deny IP on any log, but it did just give me my TCP and my source and destination. I'm going to go ahead and modify that. Run another sequence here. All right, so we've got some basic setups there. In this case, looking at connections, looking at our sessions here. And we do still have a session from router 4, so we're going to go ahead and close that on router 4. Now in this case, doing an inspection for Telnet. In this case, as shown in our session itself here, it does say that Telnet was what that was matching. Some other session up here, farther up. Earlier on, we were just doing our inspection for TCP traffic. It was just showing that as TCP. So what traffic you're inspecting will affect what it shows in your session information. You can also get into a couple different things. One option you have is custom mappings, and you also have the option of port mappings, or PAM, so port application mappings. We're going to take a look at a port mapping. Take a look at the connection on router 1. So for port mapping, being able to look at different ports, different port information, I may not have Telnet on port 23. I may have some higher numbered port. Switch back to router 2 here. And router 2, we're just going to take a VTY line. Set up a rotary. And we're going to give it, say, 30. Now the rotary command, as mentioned earlier, allowing to listen on other high numbered ports. In this case, if I was trying to telnet to 150.1.2.2 on that higher numbered port, although it's telnet, my device in the middle doesn't know that that port is telnet. So in this case, my session getting blocked for my telnet from router 4. Back to router 1. My logging information here. Set my logging to buffer to look at information, and showing denying that traffic 150.1.2.2 to the 150.1.14.4. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my mappings here. Now, the mappings for CBAC use the IP port map command. The IP port map, looking at our options, matching your protocol, and then what additional ports I have. So in this case, looking at Telnet and specifying a port. In this case, TCP, and I'm going to just do a single port of 3030. Now, additionally, you have an option for an access list if you did have that just certain hosts listening on those other ports. In this case, I'm going to say 3030 is all used for Telnet as well. So I've now defined port 3030 as Telnet traffic. So I switch back to router 4. Go ahead and try my connection again. In case password required but none set. And switch back to router 2. And just add that on that VTY line. Set a password to Cisco there. Switch back to router 4. Reestablish that connection. My connection on router 1. It does show the session. It does show the session on port 3030. And it does show that as Telnet. So being able to adjust the existing mappings and looking at traffic on other ports. In this case, I could also get to router 4. I'm going to go ahead and exit this connection. If I just telnet on the original port and take a look at that, so IP inspect sessions does still show it as telnet on the original port. So with the CBAC, with the port mapping, adjusting those mappings used for CBAC and CBAC traffic, with that port mapping, changing the port for telnet, with CBAC, it will still listen on the original port. So in this case, just adding in a port it's listening on port 23, as well as listening on the new port 3030, which I had specified up here. So listening on multiple ports. Being able to adjust the internal definitions for what ports are being used. Again, it doesn't automatically know that's telnet traffic. Having that specified so that CBAC knows to listen for telnet traffic and watch that on those alternate ports. Now, there's another command in here that's very similar. Looking at the port mapping type of options, and that would be the IP nbar port map command. And just looking at this command, looks very similar. I have a whole list of different protocols, different items, still have telnet. This one is used for nbar. So be very careful with your port mappings. If you're using the port mapping for CBAC, it's IP port map. If you're using it for nbar MQC class maps with a matched protocol, then it's the IP nbar port map. Other differences between the two, if you're doing the IP nbar port map, the IP nbar port map by default isn't going to still listen on the original port. If I want to do a port mapping for a telnet, I would need to have both ports specified and list multiple ports. So in this case, I have options. I could say 23 and 3030 and other ports. Again, have a number of port numbers up to 16 that can be listed out there if I was doing it for nbar for a MQC policy for classification. And doing it for CBAC with the IP port map, it will still by default listen on the original port. So possibilities there, different options there as far as what you can configure. Any other questions on the CBAC configuration iOS firewall? All right, we're going to go ahead and take a break here. Routing protocols. So the question on routing protocols. And also question on multiple interfaces. So starting with routing protocols. Routing protocols, getting into the restrictions on the access list. So in this case, if I have an access list on router 1, where that would affect or what that would affect, generally the issues, things to be aware of, are either things that should be allowed to initiate from the outside, router 3 or router 2, through to router 4, or things initiating from somewhere that need to terminate on router 1. Routing protocols are example of something that would be terminating on router 1. Other things could be SNMP, NTP, other port traffic, port 80, port 23, 22, SSH, telnet, depending on what I'm doing on that device. So with the routing protocols, it depends on the individual routing protocol. So things like OSPF, EIGRP, those would need to be permitted. In my access list itself, take a look at the access we had configured on router 1. Our access list itself, we went pretty wide open, permit OSPF any. In reality, with this particular topology, the OSPF traffic that he's going to see is going to be traffic from router 2, router 2's address on that subnet to the OSPF, depending on the network type, either just to the unicast address here of router 1 or to the unicast and also to the 224.0.0.5. With the other protocols, EIGRP, same thing. You have unicast address for that subnet, as well as the 224.0.0.10. RIP, you have the 224.0.0.9, or possibly the unicast if you're using a neighbor statement. That's pretty much covering the different routing protocols. The other one would be BGP. With BGP, traffic, depending on what your terminating peering points are, could be peering between the physical interface addresses, could be peering between loopback addresses. If you're peering between loopback addresses, make sure you're permitting that in the ACL. Again, that would have a destination port of 179 if router 1 was the device that received the initial connection. If router 1 was the one that established a connection, say to router 2, and it was response traffic, then it would have a source port on router 2's address of 179 and a destination of a higher numbered port. Another question on inspecting on multiple interfaces. You can get into inspection on multiple interfaces. So you could get into a bidirectional inspection type of thing. Again, as far as the access list and access list entries being made, the access list entries that would be made would be determinant on what sort of items are passing through. So in this case, if I had an access list inbound on the serial 012 interface, another access list inbound on the FA00 interface, and possibly inspections outbound in both directions, then the inspection outbound on the serial 0/0.12 would affect for being able to bypass for connections coming back through the inbound ACL on that interface, and the inspections on the FA00 outbound would be able to bypass for ACLs coming back in on that interface. If you did have the inspection on the same interface, so if I had outbound and inbound inspection there, again, it would depend on where I had ACLs. Assuming I had, say, one ACL inbound on each interface and doing inbound and outbound inspection on the serial interface, again, the items inspected in a certain direction would be affected for connections returning in the opposite direction through an ACL. In this case, if I'm inspecting outbound on the serial 00 interface, then that would affect traffic coming back in through that ACL there. If I was inspecting inbound and that traffic passed through to router 4, then that would affect the return traffic from router 4 back through to router 2 on an inbound ACL on FA00. Does the router traffic command apply to routing protocols? Generally, it depends on the routing protocols. OSPF, EIGRP are not TCP UDP. RIP, because it's using the multicast address and traffic to the 224.0.0.9, RIP itself isn't really a session between devices. It's just two unidirectional flows. So RIP, it doesn't really catch. BGP, it can catch and work fine. Generally, what would have to happen in this case, if I had a BGP connection between router 1 and router 2, router 1 would have to be the one initiating. A connection initiated from router 2 to router 1 would be blocked by that ACL. So generally, you will still need to permit for the routing protocols.